The sun lay heavy on the coast, golden light spreading like silk across the horizon, painting every stone villa and curve of the sea with the promise of a dream. Alexander moved through this canvas as though he belonged to it, each step measured, each breath rehearsed, a man dressed in wealth and certainty. His linen shirt whispered with the breeze, his polished shoes pressed into the soft sand, and beside him walked Victoria, flawless in her designer dress, laughter chiming like delicate crystal in the morning air. To the world they were perfection itself, two radiant figures gliding through a life of yachts, champagne, and handshakes sealed with power. Yet even the most dazzling picture holds shadows at its edges, and beneath his calm smile a hollow ache stirred, one he never admitted even to himself. The sound of waves rushed in with sudden urgency, and in that rush something changed. At first, it was only a shape against the glittering tide, a lone figure moving slowly near the water's edge. But then the details sharpened. The limp in her step, the curve of her shoulders, the stubborn defiance in her walk. A memory pierced him like a blade, pulling his heart back into a life he had buried with lawyers and signatures. Her dress was plain, faded by salt and time, but her presence was a fire against the endless blue. And then his gaze fell to her body, to the swell of her stomach, a sacred, undeniable truth. Pregnant, carrying his child. The world, which had moments before shimmered with luxury, turned fragile and sharp. His throat tightened, breath caught between disbelief and recognition. Clara. Her name returned with the weight of 1,000 unspoken confessions. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had walked away from, now stood before him, transformed, yet unbearably familiar. His polished life with Victoria seemed suddenly brittle, as if one gust of wind could splinter it into dust. Clara's presence was no mere chance meeting. It was the unravelling of every lie he had built to shield himself from regret. Victoria's hand tightened in his, her laughter faltering into a question he did not answer. He could not move, could not pretend this ghost was only a memory. The way Clara cradled her belly was a silent accusation, a living testament to the promises he had broken and the love he had abandoned. And as she paused, her face pale against the sea, Alexander felt a strange tremor pass through him, guilt, sorrow, but also something else, something gentler, like a thread of healing weaving through his chest where wounds had long festered. It was the first fragile note of redemption, though he dared not name it. The crowd blurred around them. Laughter, voices, children's cries, all melted into a hollow hum. He saw only her, and the life within her. A memory burned through his mind, her last call, her voice trembling with hope and fear, saying she was pregnant, pleading for just one moment of truth. He had dismissed it, silenced her words with the cold authority of a man who thought money and distance could erase love. Now the consequence of that cruelty breathed before him, undeniable. The air tasted of salt and judgment, and for the first time in years Alexander felt the weight of being seen, not as a titan of wealth, not as a man of status, but as someone who had failed at the simplest vow of the heart. The waves crept higher along the shore, lapping at Clara's feet as if to steady her, but her body wavered. He noticed the sway in her stance, the fragility hidden beneath her determined posture. Then, with a suddenness that pierced the morning calm, she faltered. Her knees buckled, her face drained of colour, and she collapsed onto the sand. A gasp tore through the crowd. Victoria's voice rose, sharp with rehearsed horror, but Alexander heard nothing but the thunder of his own pulse. The flawless illusion of his life shattered in that instant. He ran to her, not as a man of wealth, not as the figure the world admired, but as someone stripped of everything false. Sand clung to his knees as he bent beside her, her breath shallow, her hand still protectively curled over her unborn child. The sight was almost unbearable. A woman once cherished, now fighting silently for both her life and the life of their baby. In her stillness, the mirror of his betrayal reflected with merciless clarity. The crowd closed in, voices urgent, calling for an ambulance, but for him time bent, and the only sound was her faint breath against the roar of the sea. The Golden Coast no longer felt like paradise. It was a battlefield of choices, of sins demanding to be reckoned with. He had thought he could erase the past with contracts, but the past had returned, fragile and undeniable, cradled beneath her ribs. The air trembled with judgment, yet also with possibility. For in the sight of her, collapsed but still fiercely holding on to the child, Alexander felt something break within him. Yet in that breaking was also the beginning of something tender, fragile and new. Every heartbeat of that moment invited reflection, not only for him, but for anyone who has ever tried to outrun their own heart. And as you breathe with this story, let it bring you a little healing too, a reminder that even in the ruins of mistakes there can be the first flickers of light. If these words stir something within you, if you feel the weight of longing and the possibility of redemption, I invite you gently, like a whisper in the tide, to share your thoughts in the comments, to like this story if it touches your spirit, and to subscribe so that together we can continue weaving tales of love, loss, and the quiet strength it takes to begin again. The ambulance sirens would soon pierce the air, and with them the story would move forward into sterile hallways and restless nights. But for now, in this suspended breath by the sea, Alexander's perfect world had already ended, and another, more fragile, more human journey had begun, one bound not by wealth or appearances, but by the trembling miracle of a child not yet born, and the broken heart of a man just beginning to awaken. The antiseptic scent of the hospital clung to the air like an unwelcome truth, stripping away the glamour of sunlight and silk that had framed the morning. Alexander strode through the automatic doors, his chest hollow with panic, his footsteps echoing too loudly on the sterile floor. Victoria had been left in the car, her fury spilling into voicemails that vibrated against his pocket, but he no longer heard her. Every thought, every fear, every fragment of his soul was fixed on the woman who lay beyond those walls. Clara. He had once believed that walking away from her would simplify his life, that money and distance could silence the ache of love lost. But now, that lie lay in ruins, and all that remained was the raw urgency of her collapse and the fragile heartbeat of the child she carried. At the reception desk, a nurse looked at him with practiced indifference, her tired eyes unmoved by his tailored suit, by his tone sharpened by authority. "Are you family?" she asked, and the words struck him harder than any blow. He faltered, tasted the bitterness of his own absence. "I'm her ex-husband," he confessed, and the label sounded like exile. He tried to claim his place by naming himself the father of her child, but rules and signatures, the walls he himself had built, stood between them now. He had signed away his rights with the ink of pride, and the ink had dried into a prison. They sent him to the waiting chairs, those plastic thrones of the powerless, where anxious strangers clutched tissues and prayers. He sat there, a dethroned king, his empire meaningless against the single truth that he could not hold her hand or know if their child was still safe. Around him, people whispered in soft tones, but in his mind the silence was deafening. He remembered the voicemail he had deleted, the tremble in Clara's voice, the plea he had dismissed as manipulation. He had thought himself wise, protecting his fortune and his name, when in truth he had only abandoned the woman he once vowed to protect. Guilt pressed down like an anchor, but beneath the crushing weight stirred a faint thread of healing, the first fragile awareness that love cannot be managed like a contract, that life itself is not for sale. The minutes stretched into hours. His phone lit up with Victoria's messages, frantic about image, reputation, photographs. He ignored them all. For the first time in years, he did not care what the world saw. He cared only about whether Clara was breathing, whether their child's tiny heart still beat. The doors swung open, and an older man walked in, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light like a crown forged in grief. David Espinosa. His presence carried a gravity that silenced the room. He did not need introductions. His eyes, sharp with contempt, told Alexander everything. Without words, he named him what he was, a man who breaks what he cannot value, a man who leaves and only returns when the damage is beyond repair. David was ushered through the doors without hesitation, trusted and welcomed. Alexander remained outside, bound by his own past decisions, his power crumbling in the face of this quiet guardian's dignity. When David returned, relief and bitterness clung to his voice. Clara was alive, the baby still safe, though the storm of exhaustion and blood pressure had nearly stolen both. Alexander's heart nearly broke with gratitude, yet when he begged to see her, David's laugh was cruel and true. Rights were not written in bloodlines or in forgotten vows. They were earned, and he had forfeited his. His protests faltered into silence beneath David's words, each sentence a scalpel peeling away his illusions. He remembered Clara's eyes the last time they met, shadowed with sorrow, but still filled with a plea for compassion. He had answered with cold dismissal, hiding behind attorneys and sterile letters. Now, as he sat once more in the waiting room, he felt that shame bloom into something heavier than despair, a realization that healing was no longer about fixing, but about surrendering the false power he had once worshipped. The truth was simple, as all truths are. He had been given love once, and he had cast it aside. And now, standing at the edge of loss, he understood that every empire collapses when built on arrogance. When the moment came, when David finally allowed him to step through the hospital doors into Clara's room, Alexander felt himself stripped of every mask. The machines hummed softly, their beeps steady against the fragile rhythm of her breathing. She lay against pillows, her skin pale, her eyes ringed with shadows of exhaustion, yet still bright with the steel of a woman who had endured more than he ever truly knew. He whispered her name, not as a plea, but as a confession, and her gaze met his with a silence more powerful than any cry. She asked him what he wanted, and he realized he no longer knew. Money, power, apologies, all of it dissolved under the weight of her stillness. He tried to offer what he always had: wealth, comfort, a safety spun from bank accounts and signatures, but she refused it with a strength that cut deeper than anger. This was not about money. It was about humanity, about presence, about the sacred responsibility he had abandoned. She wanted nothing from him but honesty, and perhaps the one thing he had never given her: consistency. He left her room shaken, the walls of his arrogance finally crumbling. He returned to his beach house, where Victoria's sharp voice struck him like shards of glass. But as she railed about image and brand, he felt only emptiness. He realized that she had been chosen not out of love, but as a refuge from the challenge of true intimacy. She was a distraction, and distractions fade. By the time night settled over the coast, Alexander knew the truth. His life was no longer about protecting an image, but about healing a wound he himself had carved, not with grand gestures or apologies spoken too late, but with presence, small and steady as the tide. As he stared into the darkness of his glass-walled home, he thought of Clara's weary eyes, of the fragile child she carried, and of the path that lay before him. It was not a road paved with power, but one carved in humility. He would have to earn every step, not for himself, not even for forgiveness, but for the life waiting to be born. The night air carried the sound of waves, constant and soothing, like the whisper of healing itself. And within that rhythm, Alexander took his first quiet vow, not as a billionaire, not as a man defined by wealth, but as a father learning at last to show up. And as dawn approached, soft and forgiving, the story moved forward, toward the fragile beginnings of redemption that awaited in the ordinary days yet to come. The days that followed unfolded like a slow unspooling of thread, each hour binding Alexander tighter to the truth he had spent so long refusing to face. He no longer lived in the gleaming haze of yacht decks and champagne flutes. Instead, he lived in the quiet torture of waiting rooms, unanswered calls, and memories replayed in merciless detail. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her collapsing against the sand, her face pale, her hand cradling the life he had nearly let slip through indifference. That image refused to leave him, haunting him even in sleep. A soft but relentless reminder that love, real love, cannot be bought, silenced or dismissed with signatures. The hospital corridors became his penance, the harsh fluorescent lights exposing every crack in his polished armor. He tried once more to speak with Clara, to offer apologies dressed in sincerity, but her eyes remained distant, her words sharp with exhaustion. "I don't want your money," she whispered, voice steady despite the tremor of pain beneath it. "I just want peace." Those words carved deeper than fury could have, for they stripped him of the only weapons he knew. He could no longer shield himself with checks or legal threats. What she asked of him required something unfamiliar: presence, consistency, humility. He began to understand that healing was not a gift he could hand her, wrapped in wealth. It was a slow rhythm, a willingness to stay even when the silence was unbearable. It began with the smallest acts. On Tuesday mornings, he drove his car to the edge of her street, waiting as she emerged for her appointments. The first time she ignored him, walking past with the stubborn pride he had once loved. The second time, she paused, phone in hand, reading the message he sent. "I'll just drive. I won't speak if you don't want me to." After a moment that stretched like eternity, she slid into his car and they travelled together in silence. That silence was heavy, yet it was also healing, a bridge made of stillness. Week by week, their fragile routine took shape. He became her chauffeur, her silent shadow, his presence unobtrusive but constant. He began to notice the small details, the way she pressed her hand to her back as she stood, the soft hum she made when the baby kicked, the quiet determination in her eyes even when fatigue weighed her down. And slowly he allowed these details to shape him, sanding away the arrogance of the man he once was. He bought pickles when David mentioned her cravings. He left them at her door without a word, only a note that said, "Just in case." She did not thank him, but she did not throw them away either. For a man who had built empires, assembling a crib became the most humbling of tasks. The instructions mocked him with their simplicity, yet he persisted, fumbling through screws and slats, sweat on his brow, determination in his chest. When it was done, he stood back, gazing at the small wooden frame with reverence. It was more than furniture. It was a declaration, a promise made not in words, but in effort. And when Clara saw it, she did not smile. But she nodded, a small acknowledgement that meant more than any forgiveness could. Time became marked not by board meetings or stock prices, but by appointments, cravings, and the growing swell of her belly. He read parenting books late into the night, underlining passages about premature labor, swaddling techniques, signs of distress. Knowledge, once gathered for power, was now gathered for love. He wanted to be ready, not for himself, but for the fragile miracle he had abandoned once before. And slowly, Clara began to notice. Her words to him remained guarded, but her eyes softened when he steadied her steps, when he painted the nursery a soft yellow, when he waited without complaint in the cold car park outside the doctor's office. One evening, as the city lights flickered beyond her apartment window, she finally spoke to him in more than clipped syllables. "Why are you doing this?" Her gaze stayed fixed on the glass, watching the blur of headlights. His answer was simple, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him. "Because you told me the baby deserves a father, and you were right. I don't know how to be one, but I'm trying to learn." Her silence stretched, then broke with a sigh. "Buying pickles and painting walls doesn't make you a father." He nodded, accepting the truth. "I know. Being here does, showing up. That's what I failed at. That's what I'm trying to change." Her face turned then, and for the first time in months her eyes searched his, not with fury, but with weariness edged in fragile hope. That moment did not heal them, but it softened the ground between them, allowing a seed to take root. It was the beginning of something quiet, fragile, but undeniably real. The nights grew colder, autumn winds pressing against the windows of her small apartment. Inside, warmth spread in unexpected ways, through the soft hum of a heater, the quiet rustle of pages as he read about newborn care, the gentle rhythm of her breathing as she drifted into exhausted sleep. In those hours, Alexander discovered a different kind of love, not the fiery passion of their youth, but the steady, healing devotion of presence. He realized that redemption was not a destination, but a practice, renewed every morning, tested in every silence, proven in every small act. And then came the call that would change everything. It was past midnight when his phone rang, Clara's name glowing against the dark. Her voice on the other end was ragged, trembling with pain. Her words broke through his chest like ice. Her water had broken too soon. The contractions had started, fear filling every breath. She had called him, not David, not a friend, him. For in her most fragile moment, she had reached for the man she once despised, trusting him with the life of their unborn child. He grabbed his keys, his heart pounding with terror and determination. The road blurred beneath his wheels as he sped toward her, whispering prayers he had never believed in until now. When he carried her into the hospital, her body heavy in his arms, he felt the true weight of love. Not glamour, not possession, but the raw, humbling privilege of being needed. The sterile corridors swallowed them once more, machines beeping in urgent rhythm, nurses rushing her into surgery. He stood outside, helpless but present, his hands shaking with both fear and faith. Hours stretched into eternity, every second a plea for her safety, for their child's first breath. And when dawn finally broke, when the doctor emerged with weary eyes and a soft smile, the world shifted forever. Clara lived. The baby lived. They placed him before a small incubator, and inside lay his daughter, tiny, fragile, perfect. Her fist curled around his finger, and in that moment everything he had ever built, every empire, every mask, fell away. He was nothing but a man reborn in love, a father, a soul learning at last what it meant to heal, to show up, to begin again. And as the morning light spilled through the hospital window, he knew that the story of his life was no longer about what he had lost, but about what he was finally ready to protect. The next chapter was waiting, delicate as a heartbeat, and for the first time he was not afraid to step into it. The first weeks after Hope's birth were unlike anything Alexander had ever known. His life, once defined by boardrooms, tailored suits, and the endless chase of power, now unfolded in the hushed rhythm of a small apartment where soft cries pierced the night and the scent of baby powder lingered in the air. Clara sat in the rocking chair, her body still fragile from surgery, cradling their daughter with a tenderness that silenced every restless thought. He would watch her, his chest tight with awe, and realize that this, the quiet glow of lamplight, the steady lull of a mother's song, was more extraordinary than any empire he had built. They did not speak much in those early nights. Words seemed too heavy, too dangerous, too easily twisted into reminders of wounds still healing. Instead, their connection was forged in the silence between feedings, in the careful passing of the baby from one set of arms to another, in the shared fatigue that blurred day into night. He learned to swaddle with clumsy devotion, his large hands trembling as he wrapped Hope in a cocoon of blankets. He paced the narrow hallway when she cried, whispering fragments of lullabies he barely remembered, his voice breaking with both fear and wonder. Each small act was a prayer, a quiet vow whispered to the fragile life that had given him a second chance. Clara watched him with guarded eyes. Sometimes her gaze softened when she saw the way he bent over the crib, his face lined with exhaustion, whispering encouragement to the baby as if she could already understand. Other times, anger flickered across her expression, a reminder of nights she had faced alone, of months spent fighting without his presence. Forgiveness was not quick, nor should it have been. But amidst the resentment lived something else, something quieter, like the first light after a storm. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition, that he was trying, that he was present, that his healing had begun. Their conversations were practical at first. Bottles sterilized, diapers changed, doctor's appointments scheduled. But even in these mundane exchanges, a new rhythm emerged. Their voices no longer cut like weapons. They blended, tentative and fragile, weaving the beginnings of something that resembled trust. He asked her once if she needed anything, expecting her to dismiss him. Instead, she surprised him. "The baby's room still needs curtains," she said softly. It was not a demand, but an invitation, a small thread binding him to the everyday life of his child. He bought fabric, not expensive silk, but a soft cotton printed with stars. Together they hung the curtains, their silence filled with a strange peace. Hope became the center of their universe, the gravitational force pulling them together even when their past threatened to push them apart. Her tiny breaths, her delicate fingers curling around theirs, her fragile heartbeat, all of it reminded them that healing was not about erasing scars, but about building something new amidst them. Alexander found himself memorizing every detail. The way Hope's lips quivered before she cried, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she slept, the warmth of her small body against his heart. Each detail was a lesson in love, a reminder that fatherhood was not grand gestures, but quiet consistency. One evening, Clara fell asleep in the chair, Hope resting against her shoulder. Alexander watched them bathed in the golden glow of lamplight, a tableau of serenity that pierced him with both joy and sorrow. He carefully lifted the baby from her arms, not wanting to wake her. Clara stirred slightly, her lips parting as if to protest, but then relaxed, trusting him in that small moment. He rocked Hope until she slept again, his chest aching with gratitude. Healing is born in such fragile moments, in the surrender of fear, in the trust that grows slowly like ivy on old stone. Outside, autumn painted the world in shades of gold and crimson. Inside, they began to find a new rhythm. He stayed longer now, sometimes sleeping on the sofa so that Clara would not face the long nights alone. The first time he offered, her eyes searched his with suspicion, but fatigue won over pride, and she nodded. That night, as Hope's cries filled the apartment at 3 a.m, he rose before Clara could, gently lifting the baby and whispering soft nonsense into her ear until she quieted. Clara watched from the doorway, her hand pressed to her chest, her anger dulled by the sight of him pacing the small room with their child nestled against him. In those moments, the walls between them began to shift. They were not lovers again, nor were they simply strangers bound by circumstance. They were parents, learning the fragile dance of partnership born not of romance but of responsibility and devotion. And within that shared devotion, something deeper began to stir, something warm and tentative, a reminder of what they had once been and what they might still become. There were still arguments, still moments when Clara's voice trembled with old pain, when Alexander's silence felt like retreat. But now, instead of ending in slammed doors, these moments ended in the soft cry of a child pulling them back to the present, forcing them to remember what mattered most. Healing did not arrive in thunderclaps or grand apologies. It arrived in the steady beat of small acts, in the humility of showing up, in the courage to stay even when the past weighed heavy. One night, after a particularly long day, Clara sat beside him on the sofa, their daughter asleep in her bassinet. The room was quiet, but for the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the heater. "This is hard," she said finally, her voice soft, almost fragile. "Sometimes I still feel so angry, like I can't breathe." He looked at her, his gaze steady, his words simple. "You have every right to be. I don't expect forgiveness. All I can do is be here." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It was not reconciliation, but it was something, an acknowledgement that healing is not instant, but layered, built slowly over time. As winter drew near, their lives grew even more entangled. He cooked meals in her kitchen, his clumsy attempts filling the apartment with both laughter and smoke. He fixed the leaky faucet, replaced a broken chair, and filled the walls with soft light. Each act chipped away at the distance between them, creating a home that felt less like a battlefield and more like a sanctuary. The warmth that grew between them was not fiery passion, but a gentler flame, one that healed rather than consumed. And in that gentle flame they found a fragile hope, not the reckless hope of youth, but the healing hope of people who had been broken and were learning, together, how to be whole again. It was in the way Clara no longer flinched when he brushed past her in the kitchen, in the way she allowed him to hold their daughter without hovering, in the way their silences became less sharp and more companionable. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with both promise and pain. But for the first time, Alexander did not fear the uncertainty. He embraced it, for within uncertainty lived possibility. And as he stood by the window one night, watching the snow begin to fall, he felt the warmth of his daughter's breath against his chest and the quiet presence of Clara at his side. It was not a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and in its reality lay a kind of love far deeper than illusion. The future stretched before them like unmarked snow, fragile and untouched, waiting for the first steps. And as dawn crept across the horizon, Alexander knew he was ready to walk it, not as a man seeking redemption for himself, but as a father and a partner determined to build something new from the ashes of what they had lost. The story, still tender, moved forward, carrying with it the soft promise of healing and the enduring strength of love that had survived the storm. The months that followed became a season of quiet transformation. Life no longer moved at the pace of markets and negotiations, but at the tender rhythm of a newborn's breath, the gentle cadence of feedings, naps, and small discoveries. Hope grew stronger each day, her once fragile cries now blossoming into laughter that filled the apartment with warmth. For Alexander, those sounds were more valuable than the applause of investors or the echo of deals closed in glass towers. Each giggle was a healing balm, softening the scars of a past riddled with regret. He became a constant presence, not by grand declarations, but by steady devotion. The routine of fatherhood rooted itself deeply in him. Early mornings found him in the kitchen preparing bottles, fumbling with measurements but persisting until the task became second nature. Afternoons often ended with him pacing the small living room, Hope nestled against his chest, her tiny hand curled into the fabric of his shirt as he hummed songs without melody but full of sincerity. Nights stretched long, yet he no longer feared exhaustion. Each moment awake beside her crib felt like a sacred vigil. Clara observed him with a mixture of caution and reluctant admiration. She had not forgotten the loneliness of her pregnancy, the weight of nights when she had reached for him and found only silence. Yet she could not ignore the change she now saw. He was present in ways he had never been before. His arrogance softened into humility, his restlessness stilled by the steady rhythm of parenthood. Sometimes, when she saw him bent over their daughter, his brow furrowed in concentration as he learned to fasten tiny buttons or soothe midnight tears. Something inside her loosened. It was not forgiveness, but it was the beginning of trust reborn. They spoke more often now, their conversations no longer confined to logistics. One evening, as Hope gurgled on the rug between them, Clara asked softly, "What do you read when she's asleep?" He hesitated before admitting he studied books about parenting, about childhood development, even about healing broken families. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time in years she saw not the polished billionaire, but a man stripped bare, searching for redemption in the fragile pages of a life he had once neglected. Together, they began to rebuild the quiet fabric of family. Weekends were spent painting shelves, repairing the creaks in the old apartment, cooking meals that often ended in laughter when the smoke alarm shrieked from his clumsy attempts. These simple acts stitched them closer, creating a rhythm of companionship that was neither romantic nor estranged, but something in between. Hope was the thread weaving them together, her presence reminding them daily that love could be remade through small, consistent gestures. One winter morning, as snow dusted the city streets, Clara found him asleep on the sofa, Hope resting on his chest. The sight stopped her heart for a moment, the serenity on his face, the gentle rise and fall of their daughter's breathing, the quiet harmony of man and child. She pulled a blanket over them, her fingers brushing his hand, and though she quickly withdrew, a warmth lingered. Healing sometimes arrived in such fleeting touches, whispers of possibility that softened the edges of pain. Of course, the road was not smooth. Now, there were arguments, sudden bursts of anger when old wounds bled through. Clara would accuse him of abandoning her when she needed him most, and he, humbled, would accept her fury without defense. He no longer tried to erase her pain with excuses. He let it flow, knowing it was part of her healing, part of their shared reckoning. And though the clashes were sharp, they ended not in estrangement, but in the soft cries of their daughter pulling them back into the present. The baby's needs anchored them, reminding them that their bond was no longer a choice but a responsibility, one that demanded tenderness over pride. As spring returned, so too did a fragile lightness. Clara laughed more often now, a sound Alexander had nearly forgotten. The first time he heard it again, while she watched Hope splash water during a bath, he felt as though something long frozen inside him had begun to thaw. That laughter was a melody of healing, a bridge between past and present. He found himself smiling more too, discovering joy in the simplest things. Hope's first attempt at crawling, the mess of food smeared across her cheeks, the tiny hand tugging at his sleeve as though reminding him to stay rooted in the moment. One evening, after Hope had finally drifted to sleep, Clara sat across from him in the quiet living room. The lamplight softened her features, and her voice carried a vulnerability that stilled him. "I don't know what this is anymore," she admitted, gesturing between them. "We're not who we used to be, and I don't know if I can ever go back." He met her gaze, his reply gentle but certain. We don't need to go back. Maybe we're meant to build something new. Not the love we lost, but the love we can create now. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. They sat in silence, the space between them no longer hostile, but tender, alive with possibility. Forgiveness was not spoken, but it was near, like the first bloom of spring hidden beneath frost. The days unfolded in this delicate balance, each step forward fragile, yet undeniable. Together they carried hope through doctors' visits, through first smiles and teething pains, through nights of exhaustion and mornings filled with wonder. Their shared devotion became a quiet testimony that healing does not erase scars, but teaches hearts to live with them, to weave them into something stronger, something new. And as summer approached, the light in their lives grew warmer, softer, more forgiving. The apartment, once a space of loneliness and struggle, now pulsed with laughter, with the steady rhythm of family life. The journey was far from complete, but they were no longer lost. They were walking together, imperfect but present, bound by love for their daughter, and the fragile, healing thread of a trust being rewoven day by day. The story pressed onward, not with finality, but with promise, carrying them gently toward the uncharted horizon of what might come next. The night of crisis came when the world was quiet, the city wrapped in the stillness of late autumn. Alexander awoke to the sharp ring of his phone, Clara's name glowing in the dark. Her voice, thin with fear, trembled through the line. Her contractions had begun too soon, her breath ragged, her panic raw. For a moment his chest turned to ice, but then something steadier rose within him, a strength he did not know he possessed. He told her to hold on, that he was coming, his voice carrying calm even as his hands shook. The distance between them collapsed in an instant. There was no past, no betrayal, only urgency and love woven into the beating of his heart. He dressed in seconds, keys clutched in his palm, and raced into the night. The roads blurred beneath the tires, traffic lights flashing like warnings he ignored. Each red light was a prayer whispered under his breath, each turn a desperate plea to reach her in time. When he arrived, she was curled on the living room floor, her face pale with pain, sweat clinging to her temples. He gathered her in his arms, wrapped her in a blanket, and carried her down the stairs as though she were the most fragile treasure the world had ever known. The night air was cold, but her shivers pierced him deeper than the wind. At the hospital, the urgency became a storm of voices, hands, and machines. Nurses swept her away on a gurney, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the terror in her eyes. She clutched his hand as long as she could, her grip fierce, a lifeline tethering him to her fear. Then the doors closed, leaving him once more in the waiting room. But this time he was no ghost. This time he was known. His name on her forms, his number listed as a contact, his presence undeniable. Hours passed like years. He paced the sterile hallways, drank bitter coffee that scalded his throat, whispered prayers to a heaven he had long abandoned. His mind filled with visions, her laughter in the sunlight, her tears the day he left, the quiet strength she had carried through loneliness, and then, softer, the image of their daughter not yet born, a fragile hope fighting for her first breath. Each thought tightened his resolve, each memory a vow that he would never again turn away. At last the doctor appeared, her face weary but calm. Clara had survived the emergency, though the birth had come too soon. Their daughter lay in the neonatal unit, small and fragile, yet breathing on her own. Alexander followed the nurse through winding corridors until they stood before an incubator glowing softly in the dim light. And there she was, tiny, perfect, impossibly delicate. A shock of dark hair crowned her head, her chest rising and falling with stubborn rhythm. When he reached inside and placed his finger in her palm, her hand curled around it with instinctive trust. That touch unraveled him, melted every defense, broke open his soul. In that moment, love became something pure, something unshakable. He stayed there for hours, eyes fixed on the miracle that had rewritten his existence. His mind, once filled with strategies and acquisitions, now turned only to lullabies and whispered promises. The monitors beeped steadily, a song of life more beautiful than any symphony. He thought of all he had lost and all he had been given again. Healing, he realized, was not a sudden act, but a steady choice, made each day, each hour, each breath. When at last he entered Clara's room, she was pale but awake, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, yet shining with relief. He sat beside her, silent at first, unable to trust his own voice. She looked at him, her lips trembling. "Did you see her?" she whispered. He nodded, tears filling his eyes. "She's perfect," he said softly. "She's beautiful, just like her mother." For the first time in years, he reached for Clara's hand, and this time she did not pull away. They sat together in fragile peace, two souls scarred by betrayal, bound now by a love deeper than either could carry alone. Their daughter, named Hope, became the axis of their lives, the small and sacred center that drew them both forward. The future was uncertain, but uncertainty no longer terrified him. It felt instead like a gift, an unmarked path waiting for their first careful steps. The days ahead would be difficult. Nights of exhaustion, mornings of quiet struggle, moments when anger resurfaced and trust faltered. Yet Alexander knew he was ready. He had learned that redemption was not in apologies or wealth, but in showing up, in holding steady through the storms, in the quiet, healing rhythm of love lived day by day. And so the story moved forward, carrying them into the tender beginnings of a new life, one shaped not by perfection, but by presence, not by the illusions of the past, but by the fragile, enduring light of a child who had given them both the chance to begin again. The weeks after Hope's arrival were painted in the colors of exhaustion and wonder. The apartment became a sanctuary of soft cries, lullabies whispered at dawn, and the delicate chaos of diapers and bottles scattered across every surface. Alexander, once defined by power and control, found himself humbled by the rhythm of tiny needs. He learned that patience was not waiting in silence, but walking the floor at 2 a.m. with a child pressed against his chest, humming nonsense just to soothe her back to sleep. He discovered that strength was not measured in contracts or empires, but in the steadiness of arms that refused to put her down until her breathing softened into dreams. Clara watched these transformations with guarded eyes. Her body still ached from surgery, her spirit still carried the shadows of abandonment, yet she could not deny the shift she witnessed. Alexander was no longer the distant man who sent lawyers to speak in his place. He was present now, every day, every night, a quiet figure who fixed bottles, folded laundry, painted walls, and studied the shape of their daughter's hands as though memorizing a holy scripture. Sometimes, when fatigue broke her edges, she would find him already awake, cradling hope, his gaze tender and unshaken. It unsettled her, softened her, and left her heart conflicted between pain and possibility. Their conversations remained practical at first, feedings, doctor's visits, errands, but gradually something gentler emerged. He began to ask her about her day, not with formality but with genuine care. She began to answer, not with curt syllables, but with weary honesty. Healing seeped into these exchanges, quiet and unannounced, like sunlight through curtains. One evening, as Hope cooed in her bassinet, Clara admitted, "Sometimes I feel like I can't do this alone." Alexander looked at her, his reply simple, "You're not alone anymore." For the first time, she did not argue. Trust did not arrive as a single moment of forgiveness, but as countless fragile steps. She asked him to repair the leaky faucet, and he did. She mentioned the shelves were unstable, and by morning they were steady. She complained about her exhaustion, and he stayed through the night, waking before her to soothe their child. Each act was small, but together they built a foundation, a rhythm of reliability that was more powerful than any apology. He was proving not with words but with presence that he could change, that he could stay. The intimacy of shared life returned slowly, without the heat of passion but with the warmth of companionship. He cooked clumsy meals that filled the apartment with smoke and laughter. He read aloud from parenting books, stumbling over the medical terms until she laughed, despite herself. He paced the floor with Hope in his arms until his legs trembled, refusing to surrender her to tears. These moments stitched a fragile fabric of family, each thread woven with tenderness, each knot tied with the patience of healing. Yet beneath the quiet peace, old wounds still stirred. Sometimes in the middle of the night, Clara's eyes would darken with remembered pain, and her voice would sharpen. "Where were you when I needed you most?" she whispered once, unable to hold the bitterness inside. He did not defend himself. Instead, he lowered his gaze and said softly, "I was lost, and I will carry that mistake every day. But I am here now." His honesty disarmed her more than excuses ever could. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of truth accepted, even if not forgiven. As spring brightened the days, Clara allowed herself to see the man before her, not just the one who had broken her. She saw him rocking their daughter in the golden light of morning, whispering promises he thought she could not hear. She saw him repair the broken pieces of their home without complaint, his once impeccable hands now calloused from labor, unfamiliar to him. She saw him learn patience, humility, devotion, not for her, not for appearances, but for the fragile miracle they shared. Slowly, her anger began to loosen its grip, replaced by something quieter, something healing. One evening, after Hope had drifted into sleep, they sat across from each other, the lamplight soft around them. Clara studied him for a long moment, then asked, "What happens next? What are we now?" Alexander met her gaze, his voice steady. "We are parents. We are two people who love the same child more than we hate the past. And maybe that's enough for now." Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by anger, but by possibility. Their journey was far from over. The road ahead would be uneven, filled with nights of exhaustion and days when trust faltered. But in the quiet sanctuary of their small apartment, with their daughters breathing steady beside them, they discovered a fragile peace. It was not the fiery passion of their past, nor the cold silence of estrangement. It was something new, something healing, a love reshaped by pain, but strengthened by presence. And as summer approached, bringing warmth into their lives, Alexander knew that redemption was not a destination, but a daily practice. He no longer sought perfection. He sought only to show up, to hold steady, to love quietly but completely. Clara, though cautious, no longer saw him as the man who had abandoned her. She saw him as Hope's father, a man learning day by day to stay. The story pressed onward, not toward a fairy tale conclusion, but toward a future alive with uncertainty and hope. And in that fragile balance, they found the beginnings of something real. A life built not on illusion, but on the quiet, healing rhythm of love, lived one choice at a time. The seasons turned quietly, as if the world itself was holding its breath for them. The days lengthened into a rhythm that felt less fragile, though still tender, a delicate weaving of old scars and new beginnings. In the warmth of summer, their apartment bloomed with the small, chaotic beauty of family life. Toys scattered across the floor, baby clothes hung from every chair, and the faint lull of lullabies drifted through the open windows into the soft evening air. It was not a palace, not the glossy postcard of success Alexander had once called home, but in its simplicity it carried a peace more healing than anything wealth could buy. Hope grew, her laughter ringing like bells through the rooms. Each new milestone, her first smile, her first step, her first word, was a miracle, a reminder that life could begin again, even in the shadow of brokenness. Alexander found himself memorizing every detail. The way her small fingers curled around his thumb, the way her head rested against his shoulder when sleep claimed her, the way her eyes, so like Clara's, watched the world with a quiet wonder. For him, every moment was sacred, every breath a redemption. Clara, too, was changing. The bitterness that had once sharpened her words began to soften into something quieter. She still carried anger, still bore the memory of nights spent alone, but she no longer wielded that pain as a weapon. Instead, she let it sit beside her, acknowledging it without letting it define her. In its place, she nurtured a cautious trust, one built not on promises, but on Alexander's steady presence. She saw him rise in the middle of the night without complaint, saw him wash bottles and fold laundry, saw him rock their daughter with a tenderness that reached beyond words. And though her heart still hesitated, it began to open, little by little, like a flower testing the warmth of spring. Their conversations deepened. They no longer spoke only of feedings and appointments, but of hopes, fears, and dreams. Sometimes, late at night, after Hope had fallen asleep, they would sit on the balcony, the city lights flickering around them. Clara would talk about the loneliness she had endured, about the nights she had wondered if she would make it through. Alexander would listen, his silence no longer cold but reverent, carrying the weight of her truth. When he spoke, it was not to defend, but to confess, to admit the selfishness and blindness that had once guided him. Each word was part of a quiet healing, not erasing the past, but reshaping the present. One evening, Clara asked him what he wanted for the future. He thought of the empires he had once built, the wealth he had once pursued, and realized none of it mattered. "I want to be here," he said simply. "I want to be the man who stays. I don't care about the rest." His words lingered between them, fragile but real, and in the soft silence that followed, Clara's eyes filled with tears she did not hide. She did not promise him forgiveness, but she offered him something even rarer: a chance. Hope became the bridge between them, her innocence dissolving barriers pride could not. Together they celebrated her first birthday, a small gathering in the apartment filled with balloons and laughter. Alexander baked a cake that fell apart at the edges, and Clara laughed until tears streamed down her face. In that laughter something shifted, something lighter than all the heaviness they had carried. It was not a return to what they had been, but the birth of what they might yet become. As autumn came again, their lives settled into a new pattern. Alexander no longer counted days by meetings or headlines, but by hope's growth, by the rhythm of Clara's footsteps in the kitchen, by the quiet evenings when the three of them sat together in the glow of lamplight. He still carried regret like a shadow, but it no longer ruled him. It had become a teacher, guiding him toward humility, toward patience, toward love stripped of arrogance. Clara, too, learned to see him not as the man who had left her, but as the man who had returned and stayed. Her heart was still cautious, but her trust grew roots in the soil of his actions. Slowly, their conversations shifted from survival to possibility. She began to ask him about his day, about his thoughts, about the dreams he had long buried. And he, for the first time, shared not in the language of business, but in the language of vulnerability. Their love was not reborn in fireworks or grand declarations, but in the quiet, steady glow of shared life. It was in the way Alexander brushed Clara's hand as he passed her a cup of tea. It was in the way Clara leaned against him when exhaustion weighed her down. It was in the way they both looked at hope, their gazes meeting not in bitterness, but in shared wonder. Love, they discovered, did not have to be perfect to be real. It only had to be present, consistent, healing. The journey was not finished. It never would be. There would always be scars, always moments of doubt, always shadows of the past. But in the small apartment, filled with the laughter of a child and the quiet rhythm of daily life, they found something more enduring than perfection. They found resilience, forgiveness unfolding like dawn, love rewritten not as a fairy tale, but as a truth lived one day at a time. And so their story stood, not at an ending, but at a beginning. An open road stretching before them, uncertain but alive with hope. The future was unwritten, but they would walk it together, guided by the healing light of a love remade. If this story touched your heart, if you felt its warmth and healing in even the smallest way, I invite you to let your voice join ours. Leave a comment to share your thoughts. Press like if you carried something gentle from these words, and subscribe so we may continue this journey together through stories of love, redemption, and the quiet strength it takes to begin again.